Not mine yet. Okay, so let's see who we've got. We got a bunch of people already coming in. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to give about 2 minutes before we begin and let everybody get populated. So welcome to the event. We're going to go over and stream over to Facebook tonight. And where do I find that? Oh, Julie, you started this. I don't have host.
I made you host.
You made me host.
I did.
And why isn't it showing me how to share? Hang on, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right with you. I gotta see why it's being weird. Yeah, it doesn't like the live stream when I'm screen sharing. Okay. So we're gonna go over onto Facebook and we're gonna stream from there as we got 30 attendants in right now. And okay, okay, so Julie, when we go back to Facebook, we got to fix the introduction because it's not so nice. It wasn't pre-populated. Okay.
Okay.
So we have 32 of you with us now. We have 185 people registered tonight. So we're excited to get this rolling. And let's just get social media connected here. It's not going over. We got to go to YouTube, Jill. This is why we need to change our platform. It doesn't always work.
And that process is in progress.
Process is in process, yes. And on the other hand, we might be just doing it from the webinar and posting it later because it doesn't want to go there either. And this
It looks
is why
like you're on Facebook.
I canceled that stream.
Oh, might be
Try
delayed.
again. It told me it wasn't going, that there was an API issue. We'll go back again. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. Connection is timed out. Try again. Okay. Well, technology doesn't want to be my friend today, and that's okay. We'll get the message out one way or the other. So good afternoon, good evening, wherever time zone you find yourself. It is 7:01 p.m. on June 26th, 2025. And 5 years ago today, the HCMA held their patient-focused drug development meeting with the FDA, and it would have been my mother's birthday. So it's kind of an auspicious occasion to have an important conversation about generic drug quality. And today I have an amazing group of individuals to join and share the story of why generic drug quality is so important and what it is that you can do about it. So I am going to go over to screen share now. God, guys, I can't talk today. And this is our lineup tonight. So we are going to meet a patient who had a bad experience with a generic metoprolol. We're going to meet our physician hero on generic drug quality, Dr. Harry Lever. We're going to be hearing from David Light and Vic Suarez, and I'm going to go through larger explanations on where these guys come from because they're not the typical crowd that we talk to here at the HCMA, but we love them. And I'm going to be moderating this evening. If I am not my typical self, I'm a little under the weather today, so please excuse me if you like, what's the matter with Lisa? Why isn't she not her normal self? I don't feel so good right now, but we're going to do this, and then I'm going to go back to bed. Okay, so I thought I would start being really personal here. And as many of you who are watching know, and for those who don't, in 2017, I had a heart transplant. And the most common medication for heart transplants are tacrolimus, and that's to stop rejection. It is very important that your tacrolimus levels are good or you reject your organ. I have had 2 issues with generic drugs and my transplant journey. Unfortunately, Quest Diagnostics, which is where I got my blood work done, was having a problem going back to 2018, and you would have seen another dip here. But I want you to look at the numbers on the side here. 9 is a very high TAC number. Below 5.5 is not therapeutic. And I have been a transplant patient now for almost 8.5 years. And in that time, my sweet spot number is like 6.5. That's where I need to be. That's where they like me. That's where I'm healthy. But you'll see the numbers went higher and then lower, and then they kind of balanced out, but they slowly started to creep up. And as we found out, this particular manufacturer's tacrolimus that I was getting had a tendency to overdose, put in too much, and then the dissolution rate, the way it dissolves, David will explain that one to you later, it was dissolving too fast. So I would start to shake in the morning again and I'd get all these side effects. I changed manufacturers in December of 2023, actually. And because I changed manufacturers, I said, I need to go check on this and make sure it's okay. And I found myself at 3.4. And then a couple weeks later, I checked it again, or like 2 weeks later, we checked it again and it was on its way up. And then it went too high. This is all in the same dose, just different manufacturers. And then this is when I switched to name brand. And I will never switch from name brand again. So this is a really easy one to see how it can affect your blood work. And if you're down here, you're not protected. This doesn't mean that my levels drop like that. That's just testing to testing. But this is dangerous. And now we're going to take a deep dive into how these types of things happen. That was my story. We're going to hear from some other stories. But if you have not read Bottle of Lies by Catherine Eban or China RX by Rosemary Gibson, you need to go get these books. You need to read them. If we have intrigued you in any way, shape, or form that there's a problem here, these are where the receipts are held. This is where you'll see why there's a problem and why we need to do something about it. And please don't think that this is administration A versus administration B. These problems have been going on since probably the 90s. The first time I had a bad reaction to a generic drug myself was 1997, where my beta blocker was basically inert and my heart rate wouldn't get controlled. That was the first time I became aware that generics were not equals. So on that note, I am actually going to go back and Christine,
Yes.
hello. Good
Hi.
evening. Welcome to the podcast. And let's let everybody know a little bit about you and what happened. And I thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Okay. I live in Connecticut and I was diagnosed in 2006 with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. My family has the most common gene for the disease. So I am very interested in this problem. I had a problem in 2012 that I'll tell you about that is super frustrating that we're still talking about it in 2025. So I'm anxious to hear what everybody has to say tonight and contribute and state my case so that things can get corrected.
Fantastic. I'm going to swing back to you in just a few minutes. And I put up a timeline for Dr. Lever. There's a whole bunch of other things I can put into Dr. Lever's timeline. We met in 1996, and maybe 10 years later, I got a frantic call from Harry one morning. I just heard something on NPR. This is a problem. We've got a problem. I'm like, okay, what's the problem? Dr. Lever, why don't you tell us what the problem was?
Well, I was driving to work on May the 25th of 2007, listening to NPR, and I was surprised they were talking about food and drugs from China. And I really had no idea that that was going on, that we were getting drugs and food from China. And I listened all the way into work, and I got there and pulled in the garage at the Cleveland Clinic, and I badly wanted to listen to the whole program, but I had to go to work, had to see patients. So I made a couple of notes, and from then on, I started doing Google searches and finding out what I could about where drugs were coming from and what was doing. And it so happens that about a year after that, there was a bad thing that happened with heparin. The Chinese started selling a lot of heparin, and they put a chemical in it called supersulfated chondroitin sulfate. And there was a pediatric nephrologist in St. Louis who was taking care of some children on dialysis, and she recognized the fact that these children were not feeling well and sent the heparin to the CDC, and they found out that it was contaminated. And it turns out that at that time, within that year or so, about 200 people died in this country of contaminated heparin. And so all of this started me looking at drugs and where they're coming from and how they might affect my patients. And I started to notice that there were problems, that some people just weren't doing well. I had a large practice of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is an abnormal thickening of the heart muscle, and used a lot of metoprolol succinate. And I was starting to notice that patients weren't doing well, and some of them. And we began to recognize that some of the drugs were starting to come in from overseas. There was a company that had 26% of the market from India. And I started, noticing that there were problems. So that when I started seeing patients and they weren't having trouble, the first thing I would do is I would look and see which manufacturers they were using. And this would cause me to make changes. I had no ability to test anything. It was just what I would see in the patients. And that's the big difference that we have now, is we can test drugs. I couldn't do that, but I could see that there was a problem with my patients, and it started to make me make changes when I noticed it. And that's pretty much how I got involved. I noticed that people were clinically having problems, and when I would change the manufacturer, the one thing I tried to do was keep the dose the same and change the manufacturer to what I felt was a good one, usually name brand. And that's how I got involved in this. And I had numbers of patients that we could figure out that this was a major problem, that you had to change the manufacturer. And that's where that's how we did it.
So let's cycle back a little bit to Christine's story. And Christine comes to you and says, we've done the myectomy, we've done everything. I was doing so well, and then I wasn't. How did you unpack her particular problem? And I'll just let us be more conversational here.
Well, what I did was we did all the studies. This was in 2012. We did all the routine follow-up studies for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And nothing much had changed that I could see. But there was one thing that had changed, and that was the manufacturer of the drug. And once we realized that there was a change, I put it back to what she had been on. And once we did that, she started feeling better very quickly. And that made the big difference. And that's what happened with a lot of the patients that I would see, that we would we noticed in it, for instance, if we're treating high blood pressure, that a patient would come in, had usually been on one drug, and then all of a sudden somebody made a switch in that one drug, and before they knew it, they were up to 4 drugs. Well, that was because the one that they switched it to wasn't a good one, or was a generic that wasn't doing right. So people started increasing what they were taking, but they were being put on more and more doses. Well, the first thing I would do is see what they had been on before, get the best manufacturer that I could, and frequently I could, not always, but I could lower the dose. I mean, I would be able to cut out some of these drugs and if I had put them back on maybe the original one that they had been on, maybe everything would be all right with the blood pressure. Not always. It was always sort of some trial and error, but you always had to be aware, why would the drugs suddenly increase? Certainly, sometimes they really needed to do it, but sometimes just a change in the manufacturer would make a big deal, and because it would work better and they wouldn't need as many drugs.
Christine, when you changed your drugs back to a name brand, how fast could you see the difference?
It was within days. It was within days that I noticed the difference. I spent a lot of time and effort. I went to my local cardiologist for the first few weeks when I started with the shortness of breath, severe shortness of breath. and irregular heartbeats that were waking me up at night. They were extraordinary. And I went to the local doctor. He ran tests. Then I was desperate. I called Dr. Lever. He had me fly out. We booked hotel, we booked flights. We went out, we stayed there. And it was in his office at night after all the testing. And he said nothing really had changed. He asked to look at my pill bottles. And when I put them on his desk, he looks at the one and was, oh. And I'm like, you never want your doctor making that sound very bad. And I said, what's the problem? And then he explained that the maker of this drug was in India and had been known to have subpar, substandard, I guess no standards for the manufacturing processes. So he immediately took me off of it, and literally it was almost within the flight back and within the few days that I felt better.
It took you a plane, a hotel, trip across the country to find out that the medicine dispensed by your local pharmacy was the problem.
Right. And the joke of it is that the brand name, they switched it without telling me, which is a problem, and patients should know, especially now that you have your credit card and they can just switch things. They switched the medication, and I really didn't realize it. Plus, I never would have thought it would have made that big of a change. But the brand was $482 and the generic was $10.87. When I think of what my husband and I spent and the worry that it caused, because I thought my disease had progressed and I was really upset about it because they were extraordinary symptoms, it infuriates me. And that's why I'm thrilled that somebody is finally doing something about it.
And I thank you for sharing that story. It was a long time ago, and you ended up in Catherine Ebon's book with the story. So if you want to hear the story, you can get more information from Catherine's book. Catherine was on a podcast yesterday with David and Joe Graydon from People's Pharmacy and MedShadow. So we'll get that link as well for everybody, because hearing it from different points of view and a different type of conversation, I listened yesterday, and it really opened up a couple of other pathways that I hadn't really fully considered yet, even though we've been at this for quite some time. So, okay, let's go back to the slides for a minute and let's see what we have next. So, Harry sees a problem. New York Times writes on an article. It's not isolated. Bloomberg, 2019. Can you trust your drugs? We have another article. There was a ProPublica article, Wall Street Journal article, Milken Institute. All of these different organizations, these investigative journalists, they're sounding the fire alarm, and nobody's listening. We know we have supply chain issues. We found that out during COVID, but this is on steroids, pun intended for a drug joke. But we have to find out where we as people, humans in the United States, can get good information on our generic drugs and their qualities. So there's this thing that happened. So maybe you heard about it a couple of years back, that Zantac, that antacid, or whatever they call it, acid reducer, was pulled from the market because there was quality problems. Well, somebody with us tonight is the one that figured out those quality problems and got it pulled off the market and waged a war that is only the tip of the iceberg, because this is one OTC drug. Now we have all the other OTCs that are generic and all the generic prescription drugs. What's going on with the quality there? So on that note, I will introduce David Light and Vic Suarez, and they're going to take the screen from me for a little bit, and they're going to talk a little bit about this problem. Now, I had the timeline different. I thought Harry found David, and David had already found Vic, but Vic found David and said, we're working on similar concepts here. So Vic was previously with the Department of Defense, and he can give you his full background because I will not do it justice. And David Light is a pharmacist. So when you get the Department of Defense together with a pharmacist who has been a whistleblower on a major contamination of a product, things are going to start to get interesting, and you're going to learn all about it now. David, the stage is yours.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I really appreciate your engagement on this topic, and the whole Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association leading in on it. And obviously, Harry has been an incredible leader in this space, and been lucky to call him a friend for a number of years now. And, you know, I think just really high level on the point of what I do is I'm a scientist. I look at the chemical quality of medicines, and I'll give a little bit more background on Valisure and testing here in a second. But to continue in the time frame, perhaps we can start with Vic, as you were starting to introduce him, and I agree he can give his background the best, and I think he can take us through the first parts of at least this presentation, where we're talking about the light that's been shed on the pharmaceutical supply chain crisis, and Vic's really a big expert in supply chain, and getting the Defense Department involved has been, I think, one of the most scalable solutions that are possible to actually take action on this drug quality issue. So with that, hand it to Vic.
Hey, thanks, David, and thanks, Lisa, and your whole association, and welcome to all your listeners today. I'm honored to be here. So my name is Vic Suarez. I'm a retired colonel in the United States Army. Been out of service in uniform for about a year and a half, and super excited about being a civilian. So my background is, like you said, mostly in healthcare supply chain, but I was very fortunate. I had a dual career in advanced drug development, but mostly biologics, vaccine development on the biologic side. And in my tours when I did healthcare supply chain leadership roles overseas, stateside, I had been seeing for the last maybe 10 or 15 years some very large struggles we had in a supply chain that was just getting very, very difficult to source from in some cases, with shortages. And really the first kind of, eye-opening experience with some of the sensitivities in the marketplace was trying to procure doxycycline for, tens of thousands of service members deployed in the Middle East back in 2013 timeframe, where you saw this huge spike in the cost of it. And then all of a sudden, you just saw all these different fluctuations in the marketplace. And we were looking at, just how the marketplace was changing dramatically over the last 20 years. And then it started striking us that when I was looking at, a readiness issue in the military, that it was important to tie this to a national security issue, because we saw the vulnerability of sourcing medicines for our deployed service members. Would they be able to have access to them and ramp up those supplies? So what I want to really show here is, we've had all-time high shortages that peaked out last year. And we know that a lot of those shortages derive from quality issues. We've all seen, or a lot of people have seen, some of the reports from some of the inspections when the FDA is able to go and visit some of these plants. And I will tell you, and I think Dave and I share this opinion, that what you're going to see in the rest of our presentation is that not all generic medicines are bad. As a matter of fact, the super majority of them are made in high quality. And that's the best part about what we're going to talk about, is that we have an ability through independent testing and a high quality and rigorous process to actually weed out the top medicines. So if you're in the business of either prescribing these or taking these, or let's say distributing these, there is a way to actually do what's right for your patients and your health system. And it's really to kind of be curious about how do we procure the highest quality medicines for the most affordable prices from the most resilient supply chains that we can get them. And so what we see here, though, is that we also have geopolitical risk, and that's where I came in also as a Defense Department person. We saw that, we had such an over-reliance on these medicines. And what we saw right before the pandemic in 2019 was the Congress, a bipartisan Congress, as a matter of fact, sent a letter to the Defense Department leadership, specifically to Secretary Esper in 2019, asking him to look into this issue in the fall of 2019. And I saw a flurry of activities during that time frame where a bunch of leadership in the Defense Department were scrambling to find out, like, what were our vulnerabilities, what were our dependencies, and what are we going to do about it? And lo and behold, within a couple months, the pandemic hit, and we went into a whole different focus for the next 2.5 years. And so as we were about to address this issue from a national standpoint and a defense national security standpoint, we had to put that on pause for a couple years to deal with the COVID crisis. So if you shift to the next slide, Dave, I want to also talk about this kind of important point that, you know, if you look at the top line there, regulation of quality is based on self-reported data, right? The FDA does not routinely test drug products, right? If you understand how the market has shifted over the past 50 years, in the 60s, right before legislation was passed, most of the manufacturers of medicines, because most of them were just brand name medicines, were made here domestically or in Europe. And at that time, the FDA was testing several thousands of medicines, and they weren't finding any issues really of any significance. So it just didn't make sense for them to spend so many resources testing 4,000 or 5,000 medicines every year. So they switched to a new thing in some legislation that was passed in the early 60s to a new framework of GMP, or good manufacturing practice. And what that did was it really shifted the responsibility of testing the medicines and creating a framework for the manufacturers who were already doing a really good job at the time to just self-report that data to the FDA, and the FDA would then really focus on evaluating those drug filing applications, and then also set up a system where they can actually periodically visit or investigate certain plants all over the world, or mostly in the United States and in Europe at the time. But what happened, obviously, is globalization happened. And what we started to see in the 1980s and 90s, and especially around 2001, when the country really voted for most favored nation trading status to China, that we saw an entire industry, or all the industries, as a matter of fact, not just the pharmaceutical industry, shift or find ways to save money on the cost of goods sold for a variety of reasons, and shifted more of those manufacturing markets to Asia. And that really kind of changed the landscape and made it very difficult for domestic manufacturers and suppliers to really survive during that time frame if they didn't shift capabilities and resources overseas. And so, you know, there was a clear struggle to save costs. And at the time, it seemed like the right thing to do after legislation was passed in 1982, kind of bifurcating the market between brand name drugs and generic drugs. And as you can see on the lower pathways, a new drug approval, you know, can today cost over $1 billion for a new molecule to get through to FDA approval. And these drug companies spend billions of dollars doing, you know, very intensive basic research and preclinical testing, and then clinical trials that sometimes can take, you know, almost a decade just to get an FDA approved drug. The generic drugs, because they basically are making a copy of that generic medicine once that brand name medicine comes off patent, they have obviously a truncated timeline for development, and the requirement for a bioequivalence study is a much smaller pathway. And so that legislation that was passed in the 80s, in 1984, allowed for a faster pathway to approval called an abbreviated new drug application. And so you just needed a bioequivalence study. You typically had a small cohort of people of 24 to 36, and you measured their blood concentration over time. And you could basically accelerate that approval process of that drug through the ANDA process in somewhere between 6 months to 2 years potentially, and for a very much smaller price point. The challenge, though, is that the FDA had always been very, very rigorous in their approval rigor, and they still are. For the most part, they have a very rigorous approval process. The challenge is whether or not the quality, safety, and monitoring of what they do post-market of that drug does the same level of rigor and oversight. And we know that just in a lot of the reporting and also just the official records, that there are plants that supply medicines that are FDA approved that haven't been visited for over 5 years. And the FDA in the COVID pandemic exacerbated that even further. And they had a backlog as of last year of almost 2,000 plants worldwide where they hadn't been to, where their goal was to try to visit a plant, you know, every 2 years or so. There was plants that hadn't been visited for well over 5 years. And so the industry kind of took advantage of that, mostly overseas, where they realized that the FDA couldn't monitor and investigate and get access to their plants, no notice, let alone just getting there because they had such a big backlog. So that honor system became something that became a vulnerability in the system. So what's really a really big challenge here, though, is that you still had players in the market players even in India and China and even the United States and in Europe that tried to hold high standards, but they found that it was hard to keep market share. So those companies struggled. A lot of them went out of business. Some of them got to the point where they became so vulnerable, they ended up being acquired by foreign entities. So that eroded our manufacturing base to the point where, as of last year, it was assessed that about 50% of our US drug manufacturing base for the generic industry was about 50% capacity. And if you know anything about manufacturing, you typically want to have your manufacturing plant for any sector to be at least 80% or higher to have really a very viable business. But we had most of our plants, most of our plants in the United States were at 50% capacity. And so they're struggling to be viable. So if you go to the next slide, please. So, there was broad calls to action at the government level, at HHS level back in 2022. They recommended in a report, leverage the federal government's collective buying power to reform procurement protocols, revise purchasing models to increase product quality and supply chain resilience, not simply lowest cost, right? If you look at the quality, the cost, and the reliability, that resilience of the supply chain, you actually have a normal functioning market like you see in other sectors. You see this called out in the think tanks, the newspapers, and obviously on the Hill and the Senate Finance Committee. Even Senator Mike Crapo calls out, who decides which products are more, are going to be worth more compensated. Why don't we compensate for quality here? Our incentives misaligned in this case. Go to the next slide, please. And this is where the Defense Department, through the Congress, really was mandated to do something about this. So this was, a National Defense Authorization Act that was passed in 2022 to start in fiscal year 23, Section 860, that basically told the Defense Department they have to establish a working group to assess the department's pharmaceutical supply chain risk. And so they looked at this risk with the Defense Logistics Agency, and they found that about 50% of the DoD's drugs had components of it that may have derived from China, and a lot of them they just didn't know for sure. That we just had a provenance issue. We just couldn't really ascertain how much of our medicines came from sources that were adversaries to our nation. And so we also were asked to look into a quality risk, and this is where I got involved because I saw this National Defense Authorization Act, and I said, well, there's this other component that we have to be a little bit curious about, and so we ended up having a lot of meetings with senior leadership all the way up to the Joint Staff Surgeon and also to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. And basically what came down to is we started just doing a due diligence process and saying, okay, well, who could actually do some testing for us? And we actually looked all over the place, and we found that we interviewed some key leaders at University of Kentucky. We looked at different commercial labs. We looked at Texas A&M. We even brought in the dean of the pharmacy school there to advise on a couple things. And what we found at the end of the day was a private lab out of Connecticut, after a pretty rigorous process, to find somebody that could do this in an independent manner and also had a track record of finding some of these problems. And so we explored a way to do a cooperative research and development agreement with that organization. So next slide, please. And that's what eventually, in a couple months later, after we got some preliminary results out of a small grant we received, and we got some testing results, we showed some of that initial data, and one of them was actually tacrolimus. And what's interesting about that was we were able to determine some of those same problems that Dave will talk about later about, and what was covered last night in one of the other webinars, that we found out in like 30 days for probably less than $40,000, an issue that the FDA had explored for 11 years in clinical studies and probably millions of dollars. We were able to find that out in less than 30 days for a fraction of the cost. That same drug in our independent testing process, and went through secondary testing, also confirmed that was the same drug that the FDA said it was not substitutable, right? So what we're kind of having you think about is that we're going to show you where we have a process, we believe, where we can actually solve this problem. We can actually do something about it. We can tease out the high quality generics that are affordable and come from reliable supply chains. We're not here to punish organizations that just because they come from China or India. You know, we certainly want to support domestic manufacturing and our strong allies, but we want the best high quality drugs at the most affordable prices from resilient supply chains as we can deliver. And that's what we're going to do in this 2-year study that launched at the Uniformed Services University. We'll also serve as an adjunct assistant professor as well. So at this point, what I'd like to do is I'd like to turn it back over to David Light, who's going to talk a little bit about Valisure and what they've done to really be a positive disruptor in this field.
Thanks so much, Vic. I think it's excellent background and even what you were sharing, Lisa, and your own experience, and Christine on your side. That was also what started Valisure, actually. I was in a good friend of mine, Adam. We went to college together, and he called me up about 10 years ago and was telling me about very similar kinds of problems. You know, anticonvulsant medication in his case that he'd been on for many years. And every once in a while, he'd refill his medications and just feel terrible that month. Get all these side effects and relapses sometimes. And he'd talk to his doctors, and you know, he didn't have quite as good of a doctor as Harry. But you know, he's basically told that yeah, there's problems in these drugs, and you know, it's almost all made overseas these days, and it kind of just it is what it is. Nothing we can do about it as doctors. And you know, obviously Adam didn't like that answer. Came to me. I'm a scientist and you know, been in the biotech industry, kind of trying to solve problems with technology, and was pretty shocked to realize that it wasn't just Adam. You know, hearing about what Harry had done and others like Joe Graydon and the People's Pharmacy, and you know, really, the more we read about it, realizing that this is a systemic problem, and created Valisure to actually add that independent quality assurance, the trust but verify, you know, what we're used to in practically everything else that you put on your body or in your body. You're always looking for, is it organic? What are the ingredients? Where is it from? And yet none of that exists for our pharmaceuticals. So we wanted to create that. And you know, Lisa had mentioned the scenario with Zantac. You know, we've found carcinogens there, and it got taken off the market. We found dangerous impurities in drugs like metformin, top diabetes drug. We found other issues in sunscreens and hand sanitizers and body sprays, and there's been Bloomberg estimated a few years ago over $9 billion worth of products that got taken off the market when you did just this crazy thing of check. Let's just chemically check, you know, quality of products. And to Vic's point, most of them are actually quite good. We get a lot of attention when we find the bad, but really the focus of the Defense Department project was leveraging this kind of academic concept of the time. And this was published in a major journal of, let's take a lot of independent evidence, independent testing, and other evidence that could be derived from you know, independent sources, and boil all that down into a red, yellow, green score. And the intention there is to really make it actionable. And the data is very complicated, but you know, very simply try to favor the green and avoid the red. And the project at the Defense Department that's focused on their essential medicines is where we're actually taking samples of every supplier that we can get a hold of you know, medication X versus, and you might have a dozen or sometimes a few dozen. Generate a lot of data, a lot of testing on each one of those, and then that data gets reviewed by an expert review panel, a variety of co-authors of this paper, including Harry. And then this expert panel sets the lines of the red, yellow, green. Anything that's suspected of being red is also secondary tested in a network of other laboratories around the country. And after all of this work, you end up with these red, yellow, green scores. And so we're kind of in the middle, almost towards the end of the middle of this project, and we're getting some of the finalized data now on some of these drugs, and one of them is metoprolol, another one is tacrolimus. We'll talk a little bit more about those. But I think important to highlight this summary data that after all of these analytics and boiling all this down, the majority were green. 60, 70% or so are green, are objectively high quality medications. And some are yellow, and some, usually around 10, 15% are red. And that could be for a variety of reasons. But the point is, they're objectively lower quality scientifically than their competitors that are green. And wouldn't it be nice if we could just incentivize our healthcare systems or add this into our procurement? And we'll talk a little bit about that to just make sure we focus on the green, because there are a lot of them. And to that point, in the top, you see the market sweep, and you see often 20 or over a dozen individual suppliers of these drugs that are showing up green, and usually just a small handful that will be red. And to dive a little bit deeper, and this is a little bit technical, but I think pretty useful, especially for this audience, to see a bit more about drugs like metoprolol and tacrolimus. And what actually Harry had pointed out over 10 years ago now, of seeing some patients that had issues with drugs, specifically like metoprolol, that not all of them seem to have functioned the same. What we're seeing here is, first of all, the score. So you have over a dozen different suppliers, different labelers, companies that are making these drugs or selling these drugs, and then the final score. And it's a 0 to 100 score. Sometimes if you have a few things that go wrong, you could even get negative level of the score. And there's a variety of tests that get run. We look at the dosage, how much of the actual active ingredient is in there, the dissolution, how the drug comes apart, and then various safety metrics like various carcinogens, toxic elements. I believe in this case it was lead that was found substantively higher in some of these manufacturers than others, that created some scoring implications that then lower the score. And you can see that the biggest problem that we were finding most consistently with metoprolol was the dissolution, basically how the drug comes apart over time. And this graph on the right summarizes that. In what you're seeing in the dark black line is the brand. That's the drug that went through thousands of people clinical trial, and they designed those pills to dissolve in a very specific pattern. That is that black line. And then in the gray, all the various gray lines are different generic companies, labelers that are making this drug. And again, good news, many of them are very close to that black line. But obviously some, even by eye, you can clearly tell, in this case, are substantively slower. The fact that the curve is below the black line is basically telling us that it's dissolving slower than the original brand. And through a complex set of difference factor percentage analysis, you end up with this dissolution score that can turn some of these products red. And so if we wanted to be most consistent with the brand, you would stick with the green, and there's many different options that are indeed green. And we saw a very similar issue with tacrolimus. So various other drugs like metformin have had a lot of issues with carcinogens. In this case, the tacrolimus was not only clean with carcinogens, clean in terms of toxic elements, but again, we saw pretty dramatic in this case differences with their dissolution rates, how the drug is coming apart. What Lisa was showing in her own charts is quite concerning, because if it's dissolving so significantly different, and in this case, because it's above the brand curve, it's dissolving much faster than the brand was. Could it be dumping a lot of that medication very quickly, and just not having the designed therapeutic effect that the original brand did? And so we saw that again. a variety of scores implicated in the market sweep of the tacrolimus drug. And what was particularly interesting with tacrolimus is that as was talked about and Vic highlighted, is that the FDA also did an 11-year study, or 11 years of looking at this from a clinical perspective and looking at actual blood levels in patients. And you can see here in the white is the generic, in this case, the same manufacturer that was the dotted line red, the dramatically faster product, and very different pattern than the brand. And so different, in fact, that it even had a clinical determination implication, which is that it is not bioequivalent. And unfortunately still remains on the market, but the point is that it doesn't have the same rating anymore of being interchangeable. And this is looking at just the cord and a variety of different products that we had analyzed versus the brand, and pretty consistently much faster. And ProPublica just published an article this week and talking to patients that have had not only the blood level changes that Lisa was showing, but had actually lost an organ. In this case, a kidney that this patient had received from his wife, and then the generic the drug got switched to the same manufacturer, and shortly after, much to the shock of his doctors, lost his kidney, unfortunately. And it's a pretty eye-opening example. I mean, obviously from a public health and a patient perspective, terrible to hear these kinds of stories. And even from an overall healthcare system, and if you think of all of chronic disease, this can have tremendous impact. There could be thousands of adverse events. I mean, you hear these individual stories, but you multiply it by the millions of people that are taking these drugs. Some of the early and rather conservative estimates are really predicting thousands of these adverse events and billions of dollars of potential damages in public health. And you think of even the tacrolimus story, you have a heart transplant or a kidney transplant, that could be $1 million procedure that then get risked on a $5 generic. I mean, it's not a good balance of risk, obviously. And so we're hoping that a lot of this engagement, a lot of this, you're really identifying the core problems that we're seeing and identifying solutions will enable us to get the action that we need to actually fix this. This is a lot of what's getting discussed now in the Hill, and kind of the boiling down of the Defense Department project is that we can now generate these actionable quality scores that are actually attached to these manufacturers, attached to their national drug codes, which are the codes that every pharmacy, distributor, manufacturer, health system, insurance company are all either buying or reimbursing a drug by the national drug codes, and these scores are attached to that, so that we can hopefully evolve from this blinded system that we have right now of is it FDA approved and what's the lowest price, which is the status quo, and start to have a best value system where we can look at objective metrics like the quality, especially for Defense Department, VA, the Federal Supply Schedule, that's particularly interested in getting more American-made products and moving our supply chains close to home. There could be location, independently derived location scores. Health systems like Kaiser Permanente are requiring certification in some of their generic drug purchasing. Can there be some bonus points done for that for the manufacturers that are doing it? And the point is to have more information than currently nothing other than just an FDA approval to make our best decisions, to have affordable drugs accessible to patients throughout the United States, but are also quality and as much as possible, onshore and friendshored. And so that's where we're at now, and hopefully going with the help of folks like the Hypertrophic Cardiomyopathy Association to really bring this to light and to push members on the Hill to take this seriously. I think we have an amazing opportunity now to really start fixing this fundamentally as a system. So yeah, thanks again for taking the time to listen on this.
Now we have questions, and some of them are good. You're welcome to use the Q&A box, and we will address as many questions as possible. We want to try to make this a bit more conversational. I do have an action plan for you. In the chat, you will see a link to something called ujoin.co. It's a campaign. If you click on that link, you can send a letter to your elected officials, which kind of summarizes everything we're talking about here today and why it's important to keep vigilance on generic drug quality and the different mechanisms in which we can do that. So if you want to have your lawmakers hear your voice on this, please share the link with your friends and family. If anybody you know has been affected by generic drug quality, we also have a survey that we're going to let you fill out some information and tell us a little bit about what happened. So let's go to the Q&A, and then I'll show you all the other fun things that we have. There's a hand raised in the attendees. Please use the Q&A box. We'll be happy to address anything. We're not taking purple questions this evening. So Chip is asking, isn't U.S. Pharmacopoeia supposed to provide confidence around the quality control issues? So who is Pharmacopoeia and what is their role in the pharmaceutical drug supply chain? David or Vic, want to take that one?
Sure, happy to take it. And I think a lot of the misconception around how this works was actually, I think, pretty nicely addressed by how Vic talked through the regulatory framework. And I think there is a lot of that misconception that the FDA or other kind of pseudo-regulatory agencies like USP or United States Pharmacopoeia, which works with FDA, is out there testing drugs and testing the compliance of these drugs. And it's really a self-reported honor system. To say, however, that it is a very important part of the overall quality of the medications that we have in the United States, the process is incredibly important. Making these inspections that the FDA does. USP has these monographs of tests that should be run and kind of defining the box of good manufacturing practice from a chemistry perspective is very important. And I think that's a big part of the reason why the majority of the drugs that we have here are green, are good. But it is only, to use Vic's terminology, one leg of the stool, right? You have your regulatory piece. You have the manufacturers themselves and their own testing that they need to perform. And usually you have an independent review component. Cars are also regulated. There's a Highway Safety Administration that looks at the laws of what is required for a car to be legal on the road. But you don't buy a mid-size sedan just based on whether it's legal or not. You look at Carfax reports. You look at J.D. Power and Associates. You look at the IIHS safety ratings that were created to add transparency to the objective quality of cars. And I think that is what we're missing. So, the FDA, USP are doing their part on the process side. And we really need that kind of independent testing side and independent data on the quality transparency to be added.
So we have another thank you, David. That was great. We have a couple of really good questions, but somebody said, how do you know where to see who your manufacturer is? And I do have I'm going to share a screen here. Pulled up my Hill Day talk because I didn't put it in this one. So who made this drug and where was it made? So when you look at your pharmacy label, you've got a lot of information in very small font. If you're like me, you need your cell phone to read your label so that you can blow it up and actually read it, because we're old and we have bad eyes. But if you look very carefully right down here, it says MFR manufacturer, Cipla USA Incorporated. So it is rather a trick question. Where was this drug made? The label would indicate that Cipla USA, which would make you think it was manufactured in the United States. It is not manufactured in the United States. It is manufactured in India, and it is packaged in Warren, New Jersey. That's a very different story than my drug is made in New Jersey. We don't make generic drugs in New Jersey at any rate. So you need to look inside the box on the little paper to find out where your drugs were made. Easiest, safest thing to do is find a trusted manufacturer that's working well for you and ask that you always stay on that manufacturer. Or you can do, which I hear is getting to be a bit more problematic, your physician can write a dispense as written prescription for name brand. It's going to cost you more. A company called Milenta has Metropolol available for name brand. It's like $30 a month for your Metropolol. So you can get name brand. It does cost you more. Your insurance company may not pay for it. We want to tell the insurance companies and the payer systems that they're being short-sighted, that they should make sure that we're getting quality drugs and not charge us more to get quality drugs. It's their responsibility to get us quality, and they can't shirk that duty off onto somebody else. If they know that they're giving us a lesser quality product, they need to be held accountable for that. We need regulatory language to stop them, which is a little bit bigger of an issue than we have to deal with today. But that is one way that you can tell where your drugs are made and how they break down. So Chip also asked what percentage of red, yellow, green, how does it break down into the percentages over the US market? I think David's slide answered that. If you have any additional questions, we can take a specific question. So somebody wrote, is it possible that these drugs are impacting clinical trials? And I think the answer is yes. There you go. There's the point that I think is important, because many patients with HCM specifically, let's just stay in our disease state today, but it can be used for any other disease. You're typically on background therapy when you're in a clinical trial today. And if your background therapy medication is not working, your trial is going to look bad because you're expecting the drug to be maximized, and you're going to look for the best possible medical management of that patient and then add them into a clinical trial. If their background therapy is bad, it could make your trial tank, and you got billions of dollars invested in a clinical trial. To David's point, you got $1 million heart transplant to waste it on a $5 drug. When we're talking about drug discovery, we could be talking about $1 billion in discovery to be totally off-thrown by the quality of the generic that was used. Harry, David, Vic, any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I would just add that, the new drug application, the new novel therapeutics are coming out that are trying to solve really, really big complex problems. I think this is something that they really need to start thinking about to not further complicate or confound their clinical studies, where they might have somebody that, again, is on a well-controlled medicine, but for some reason during that trial period, they get switched out to no fault of their own. And then they all of a sudden have some adverse event or some other just change in their response. And it would be wise for them, the clinical, the PI and all those people that are investigating what might have happened, to always just check, was there a change in their medications? And a lot of good studies are designed that way, to just kind of investigate. But it's not something everybody assumes, right? The assumption is that they're on an FDA-approved drugs and they're all equivalent, because that's what you've been told. That's what the FDA has been saying for many years, even though most people in the industry know that that's not necessarily true, that there's plenty of variability out there, and it could be a factor. So I think this would be wise for a lot of the drug companies that are testing the new round of quality, their medicines, to kind of verify that the person that's on a drug that's stable ought to stay on that stable drug, the same drug, throughout the trial at least, or else it can affect a clinical trial. Back to you.
Yeah, maybe one other thing to add on to that, Lisa, is a very important point that everybody raised regarding the clinical trials themselves. And I'll just say that a lot of the basis of that slide that I was showing about trying to calculate the billions of dollars of damages and the thousands of adverse events come from some of these kind of clinical outcome epidemiological studies looking backwards. But seeing those kinds of correlations, seeing correlations between generic drug use versus brand, and this is taken in aggregate. And this was done with diseases like epilepsy, where they found there were higher rates of hospitalizations, higher rates of head fracture and breakthrough seizures when patients were switched around with their drugs And if that's turning into these bad outcomes epidemiologically, looking at the healthcare data going backwards, then surely in a clinical trial, you're going to have the very similar kind of noise with your patient cohort that can significantly put at risk or make it even that much harder to see the benefit of a new therapeutic. And just to say as well that there's some of the latest epidemiological studies, and there's one done on atorvastatin, one of the most prescribed drugs in the United States for treating high cholesterol, where they were seeing differences not just in general between generic and brand, but I think very important to our message that it's not all generics. Specific generic manufacturers had significantly higher adverse outcomes than others in their study. And there's enough patients on there that they're able to see that, again, going backwards. But it really underscores exactly the point that you made, Lisa, is that we need to be cognizant of this in a variety of different ways of looking at this problem. And certainly don't forget about the new therapies and the background therapy that deals with generic drugs.
Can I add another thing too? I want to also
Yeah.
disclose, like David and I, we're not funded by big pharma to basically promote their drugs, right?
No.
We even see in some cases, occasionally, and we saw that with the recall of Zantac, even the big brand name blockbuster billion-dollar drug sometimes, has issues. But we've even seen recently data where even the authorized generic, the one that, has the same formulation under a license from the brand, manufacture it in another location, we see most of the time those authorized generics are usually the highest quality of all the generics, but on occasion we see them not. And that has a lot to do sometimes with just how that particular, manufacturer is actually, running their manufacturing process. Just because they have the exact formulation for the company doesn't mean they adhere to the best quality manufacturing processes. That's why we check all of them, right? We check the brand, we check the authorized generics, and we check all the generics that we can get a hold of. And we just call balls and strikes as the data sees it. And we have a very rigorous process that even when a drug is identified as red, tested, high risk in the primary lab, let's say at Valisure, we then they'll double and triple check that again at Valisure. But then when they deem it as a high risk, it gets sent to one of about 5 or 6 labs in a secondary lab testing network, right? Where it's tested again in a blinded way. And then that data is then reviewed again by another expert review panel that doesn't even know what manufacturer it is. They just see the data and they score it objectively against the brand and all the other generics. So it goes through a very, very thorough process. So by the time it gets through those 3 levels, it's a red drug, it's a high risk drug, right? And all we're saying is that's not a regulatory judgment. That drug should be okay to stay on the market. It meets maybe some of the basic regulatory requirements, but relative to the other high quality options, why would you buy a drug that has a bunch of lead and arsenic in it? It's just right below the threshold when you had 5 or 6 other options for roughly the same price point. And so we're doing a due diligence process and we're helping large health systems do the right thing with their distributors and their suppliers. So in the long run, you can actually say that you're doing something for patients, right? That's really at the bottom line of what we're doing. This is for patients. This is not to make a buck. This is to actually give patients the best chance they have for the best outcomes.
So people are looking for very specific information that we don't have available yet. They want to know who is the trusted, who is the untrusted, who is the red, yellow, and green, so that they can make buying decisions based on this information. Can you tell us when we might know and when this might be what's the word I'm looking for? When this will be unveiled as to who is labeler A, B, C, D, or E?
Sure, and I think it's important to underscore that that's unfortunately part of the complexity. And in Catherine Eben's book Bottle of Lies, and primarily driven by Harry's observations, when all you have is anecdotal evidence of case studies and you don't have testing and you don't have a systematic process, Harry might be able to determine, well, this manufacturer is going to go on a blacklist. And absent any other information, that's about as good as you can do, is try to avoid this one as opposed to that one. But the reality is that it's a very global system. You could have manufacturer X that'll have 10 different factories all over the world. And you know, these 5 drugs that they make could be particularly concerning, could be reds, and another 10 or 5 drugs could be great, and vice versa. Just because you got a great drug from manufacturer X and you're doing so great on it, a different drug made by that same manufacturer, if it's even the same, even if the actual manufacturer, right? It might say, you know, to your point, manufacturer USA, and that's actually
Not
just
so
a
much.
paperwork organization, right? And you know, in your Cipla example, looks like it was also made by Cipla as an actual manufacturer and as a repackager in the United States. We see all the time, especially with the Defense Department, where there's companies that all they do is just repackage. They're just making the package, and the actual original manufacturer is somebody completely different. That could also, to Vic's point, be bought out by somebody completely different. So it's unfortunately a very complicated answer. I think it does stay reasonably consistent within manufacturer. So if you're taking metoprolol, you know, there could be a green and a red that will hopefully be fairly consistent within the manufacturing of metoprolol. And obviously our hope, Vic and I, is as this process gets further utilized and taken into account by purchasing systems and healthcare systems, that the reds will eventually turn green, either go off the market if it's too hard to fix, or just fix the system. We're very transparent in all of our studies. You know, Zantac or metformin or any of these things that you hear about in the news, we publish the data, we publish the methodologies. We sometimes have debate over the methodologies. I'm a scientist. I'm happy to get into any details that anybody wants. And we're very transparent about that. But it's complicated information and complicated supply chain. All that said, we are hoping to be publishing this kind of work soon with the Defense Department. We actually just published a paper with them on essential medicines lists, actually going through all of these various lists. It was published in the Journal of the American Pharmacists Association quite recently. We did publish a paper with Stanford University, Kevin Schulman, who's a very accomplished, prominent doctor, and also has an appointment at the business school. And we looked at ADHD medications, methylphenidate, and all the manufacturers are outlined there. You can go and read the paper. You can see the tables. And this was actually the first paper to use this Defense Department scoring framework to then label those manufacturers. And so that's there in the paper. And long-winded way of saying is that we're getting there. Hopefully in some number of months, we'll have a lot of this data together and be able to publish. Publication takes usually some months or years sometimes, but you know, we obviously want to be as transparent as we possibly can be when all of this data is ready to go out. And I think ultimately what we really need in the United States of America is to solve this for the millions of patients. A drug like metoprolol, there's something like 15 million patients in the United States that take this drug. And we need to fix it for all of them, ideally.
But at the same,
that's when it takes the kind of health system level engagement to just buy green and avoid red.
at the same time, we've got to insist that there's consistent testing, batch after
Totally agree.
batch, and we can't just let it just occasionally do it. You got to do it all the time. And the other problem is you got to be very careful when you ship the drugs. Is it too hot? How is it if it's coming long distances? What's going on? And you got to know that the batch is okay. I mean,
that's a point that's really unique about independent testing versus, let's say, for cause testing, right? And this is a vulnerability that you have when, let's say, the regulatory agency sends out an investigator to a plant in an overseas place or even in the United States, and they say, well, we find all these areas of concern, and we're going to want you to send some of your samples of the medicines to one of our labs at the FDA or one of the regulatory agencies. Well, you're asking them to actually send that. And if you go back to Bottle of Lies, that was the classic scam that now defunct company Ranbaxy did, right? And how do we know this? Like, one of our study advisors that we work with was in charge of the FDA test lab at the time, and was able to determine that one of the scams that company did in some cases was they took the brand name pill and they packaged it in their thing, and then they sent it off to the FDA, and then FDA quickly saw that was the scam. So what we do differently in true independent testing, right, is a blind market sweep of the system, allowing the supply chain to work like it's normally going to work, right, through a prime vendor system, pharmacy prime vendor, and buy it like a health system or somebody that would buy it normally through the supply chain. And that's where you can prevent any company from sending you their sample floor model that's been perfectly, exquisitely made for the testing purpose. That's a true test of an independent test. They don't know when they're going to get tested, but they know that they are going to get tested when we list, these are the ones we're going after to test. So that's the kind of stuff that Consumer Reports does, so that you can buy the best products. And that's why in the consumer electronics industry, why in the automobile industry, those automobiles and those consumer electronics actually get better quality over time and actually more affordable over time, because there's that market it's a healthy market where price and quality are actually and transparency to that quality and reliability is actually available. It's not in our industry, and that's what we're trying to bring, is more transparency to the marketplace, to physicians, pharmacists, and patients, and the people that buy the medicines for patients.
Okay, boys and girls, we got a lot of questions, and I want to make sure that we get through them all. We got about 20 minutes left and 23 questions. So this is what we call the speed round. We've answered a bunch of the questions related to how to tell for who manufactures it by the label. Knowing the quality of the drug in the bottle right now, unfortunately, we don't have a methodology that I can say, okay, here's a system that you can drop a pill in and it'll tell you if it's okay or not. We haven't invented that yet, and maybe David will come up with something for that. I don't know. But for right now,
we'll work together.
We'll work together. We'll figure that one out, because I'd like to know if my tacrolimus is good every time I open a bottle. So we have a lot still to learn about how to organize all of this data on all of the patients who've been harmed. We need to organize the data on where the good quality drugs are. And David and Vic are moving towards that end with these lists and these publications that they're putting together. For those of you who have asked the questions related to, and there's like 6 or 7 of them, how do I get my insurance company to pay for it? Well, I don't know the exact answer, but I know what we're going to try to do. There's going to be, I'm going to show you a call to action page in just a few moments, and you use the QR code, go to our landing page. There's a survey for you to take. That survey will give you the opportunity to give us the ability to send a letter to your payer company. We are concerned about generic drug quality. Here's some stuff you need to know. Please take a look at it. And we hope that our payer systems will provide us with good quality drug, because you're only making us sicker, and this just seems to not be in anybody's best interest. So you can click and you can send it in there. The UJoin link, which will be sent to you after the event as well. Sometimes, for whatever reason, picking up links in the chat doesn't work so good. So we'll get that off to you all as well. And that goes to your elected officials. And that'll go to your federal senators, federal congressmen. We have it going to the governors of the state and your state representatives as well, because states buy drugs too. So we want to kind of shotgun approach all of the payer systems and all of the people responsible for buying those bulk drugs, and letting them know that there's a safer and more effective way to do it. We have a couple of really in-depth questions. Amadou, who will be shortly announced as one of our newest board members. So welcome, Amadou. He nails it. It's a global issue. And he refers to some research on published yesterday in Lancet Global Health, which examined the amount of active ingredient in common types of cancer drugs. So there's interest at the World Health Organization on this. And Amadou's bringing up the fact that they consist of 20 different generic drugs made by 17 different manufacturers, and most of the companies are based in India. On balance, more than 30 manufacturers made products that meet standards. So there's other writings out there. Amadou, that was really helpful. Thank you. And then I know Debbie Hamilton. Debbie, I don't know how to get them to pay for the name brand. I'm not. I'm on tier 4. I pay $120 a month for my tacrolimus, and I take less of it. I was on 1.5, so I needed 2 prescriptions. Now I'm only on 1 prescription because I only need 1 milligram twice a day, and that covers me when I'm on name brand. So overall, it's actually almost equal in price for me because I'm going from 2 meds to 1. So we're working on those problems, and maybe sending in an appeal would be helpful. The only discount program that I'm aware of is the GoodRx plan for Metoprolol. You want to check on the publicly available PBMs, which is like a GoodRx. We don't have the list yet. I'm clearing through the questions. Amadou, I think your insights were really helpul there. Rosemary Gibson's with us. Hi, Rosemary. Good to see you here. Dave, we've talked about strategies to engage HHS, FDA along the same lines as Food and Drug has been called upon to remove harmful dyes and preservatives. HHS could convene more than 6 companies sourcing 90% of the generics and hold them accountable for providing poor quality drugs into our U.S. supply chain. I think as much as we are living in 2025 and all that it means, because I don't have to explain it to everybody, you're all living it with me, this is the time for federal change. This is the time that we can maybe move the mark on this. This isn't a problem of the last administration or the one before that or the one before that. Hatch-Waxman, which allowed generic drugs to be distributed, was passed in 1984. What product do you have in your house from 1984 that you feel confident about its performance? It's a long time. It's a long time. So should we be going back and reevaluating what a bioequivalency even is? Hatch-Waxman said bioequivalency was between 80% and 125% of the original preparation. Have we evolved to a point where we know the drugs are more specific and that's too wide of a berth? Somebody asked about Eliquis going generic. I got to tell you, I'm a little afraid about that. We have a lot of patients on Eliquis. It is an anticoagulant. It stops you from having strokes, DVT blood clots, pulmonary embolism. And you want to trust that with a manufacturer overseas right now when we know these problems already exist. What if you get too little blood thinner? What if you get too much blood thinner?
There's
What
a
if you
big
round
problem
it?
with that, Lisa. There's a big problem with that drug because there's not a good way to test it in the patient to see what his blood what his level is
You get
of
no INR, right?
anticoagulant.
Right. So we need to know that it's good.
Right.
So I've already talked to some people, in pharma and said, hey, is this going to be safe to go generic? And they went, we don't really know because it's not something that we really focus on because there's a process. Your drug gets a label, it gets so many years as your independent label, and then it goes into generic, and then you don't have control anymore. Is that the right thing to do for patients? I'm wondering. So, Rosemary, I love your idea, and I think that's something we can all definitely work on together. Susan, any advice for patients now? Some of us are on 3 or 4 medications. The best advice I could give is check your labels, compare them to your old drugs when you're bringing them into your house. If they're different, it doesn't mean it's bad. Focus on how you feel. If you notice more symptoms, more palpitations,
No, don't bring them into your house
but
till
you
you
can't.
look at them in the drugstore.
The drugstore's not going to turn it around on you. You
Well,
can't.
you can tell them that you don't want to change the manufacturer. You've got to do that.
But what we're finding is the CVS's and the Walgreens, they have a certain product on the shelf and they're not going to replace it unless you go through a battle. So you have to do the battle before you pick it up. If you get it home and it doesn't match, call your pharmacist, say it doesn't match. It doesn't mean that it's bad. You should see how you feel. And if you notice any symptoms or change, then you need to immediately contact your physician and take corrective action.
But you don't. They will not let you return it
Nope.
once you take it out of the store. That's a fact.
No, as soon as it leaves the shelf, like as you hand it over the counter, if you walk away, they don't want it back. If you're standing there with them, they might. But if they only have this manufacturer, you're going to have a problem. I had this problem when I had to pick up extra tacrolimus in a pharmacy. I'm like, no, I want name brand. We don't carry name brand. Well, I don't want the drug then. I need the name brand. So I walked away without it. So these are all real big problems. So Judy's asking, where can you find the source of the different manufacturers? I showed you the picture of the bottle. It may not always be in that same spot on the bottle. It could be on the bottom. Seriously, take your cell phone out, blow it up. You'll find it. The manufacturer is required to be there by law. Correct, David?
It does depend a little bit on the state, like exactly what the state's labeling laws are. But I believe it might be universal that a manufacturer name, or at least the company that is registered that National Drug Code should be on there. Though honestly, to your point, Lisa, what's written on there is not necessarily who actually manufactured it. And I don't know if they always need to put the National Drug Code, but if you can find the National Drug Code of your prescription, you can look that up at a site called DailyMed. If you
DailyMed.
Google DailyMed and type in that National Drug Code, then you can get the actual original manufacturing label and might be able to get the inference of who actually made it. That's a very long process just to maybe get the information that you're talking about.
Malenta is now charging $40 a month for Toprol. Is there a time frame when we can expect manufacturer name for safe generics? I don't have a time frame. I can tell you where the problem is. I can tell you that we need to speak up about it. I can tell you that we are making some action with the Department of Defense. And because of their investigative process and putting the information on the National Drug Registry, many people who are buying bulk drug will be able to see where they can get quality, not just price. So this kind of comes into grassroots advocacy. We got to send letters. We got to make some stink. We got to talk to the payer systems. We got to talk to the hospital pharmacies. Hospital pharmacies typically only deal with meds for inside the institution. So it may not be where you get your prescriptions filled, but if we know they're getting quality, then that's a good thing. So we have some problems there. So I answered that one. We got a lot of them. I'm trying to cruise through them. Y'all asked some good questions. I talked about Bristol Myers Squibb and Eliquist. Vic provided comparisons in his presentations for drugs made in US, India, and China. What about generics made in Europe or Israel, for example? What do we know about their processes?
Well, I think just in general, I would say that, we do have some observations that the medicines that we test that, I mean, and this is in publications and also just our observations from the internal testing that we're doing on behalf of the Department of Defense, that in general, the domestically made medicines relative to the ones made in India and China are consistently better. And also there's publications about even outcomes on, patient care as well. But I think we also do see, that slightly better than Asia we see in Europe. I would let David, opine about Israel. Israel is typically what Teva and a couple other, manufacturers that are there. But typically the European organizations, again, I'm not an endorser of any particular European company, but there is one that's, I think, based out of Germany that, I mean, I think we see consistently high quality practices out of a company. I mean, I've seen, Fresenius Kabi pretty consistently high quality. It's a pretty highly reputable generic manufacturer in Europe. So, I mean, that's one example of some observations of some of the medicines and the practices that some of these companies, stand by. So, David, anything to add about that?
Yeah, and I think you're right that there's definitely some trends. I think the paper that you were talking about, Professor John Gray and his team at Ohio State University published a paper just a couple months ago showing that there's around over 50% higher rate of serious adverse events on generic drugs manufactured in India versus those manufactured in the United States, the same drugs. That's a pretty compelling finding. We've actually been working with John Gray, showed some early data in a few public presentations that also saw similar kinds of correlations with carcinogenic contaminants in drugs like metformin. But even in that same data, I think it was important to underscore that there were Indian manufacturers that produced a very clean product. The overall aggregate in India, which also had the most total manufacturers, so it's not like a perfect, comparison. The aggregate was substantially worse, but there were definitely specific manufacturers that were good. And to Vic's earlier point, there's scenarios where the brand is bad, compared to even some of the generics, or just the Zantac scenario. Zantac was bad, just like the generics were bad. So it's a complicated case. There are trends, and I think there's a lot of reasons, national security reasons, and others that we want to bring as much as we can into the United States, or close, like European allies. But it's a complicated problem that we need to at least start pushing in the right direction.
Yeah, and what I'll talk about a little nuance too, that's kind of an observation and a trend too, is that, if you go from the brand name consistently, we're seeing, especially in like purity and dosage, we're seeing that like almost consistently hit the mark right at 100%, purity. Like if they've got a 90 to 110% window for bioequivalence for the generic, we're often seeing in primary and secondary testing that the brand is like right rock solid at 100, 99, 100, a lot more consistently than a lot of other alternatives. But the other trend is the next level down typically is the authorized generic, right? Because they actually have the proprietary formulation that they have a license for. So typically, those organizations typically do pretty well next. So if you're trying to kind of sleuth and find companies that are in that category, the authorized generics typically are the next category. The next category, I think, that we're talking about high quality, are those established generic manufacturers, but also have an arm of specialty meds where they're also making some novel specialty medicines, typically because they also have a strong R&D component, and they have like research and development, and they also, because they are making some new medicines, specialty medicines, they've invested in a lot of the science and technology, the analytical testing, and have a real, a more serious quality unit and a controls and manufacturing capabilities in those types of organizations that are making new meds as well. So, and then it goes to generic manufacturers, and are they really a relabeler, repackager, or are they really, making the product, and then where are they sourcing their materials, and do they actually have, trading partner audit agreements among their trading partners, right? Is that company actually looking at their suppliers independently and auditing their supply chain and actually testing their materials, whether it's key starting materials or API, active pharmaceutical ingredients? Those are some best practices that you'll see to separate some of these companies among each other. But the top kind of 2 or 3 realm is the trends. Your probability of success to find a green is probably a little bit higher. And I think we would love to get to the point where we'll see broader adoption amongst these large health systems, so that this just becomes the standard, and that the market basically pushes out systematically the greens. And somebody asked earlier, in the chat or the question, are we actually seeing, where some of these greens are like actually having to test consistently to stay kind of purchased? And I think Dave can talk to the Kaiser example, where, Kaiser Permanente, requires that every batch gets tested and that they remain green to have a long-term exclusive sales deal with Kaiser. So if you're a Kaiser beneficiary, know that that healthcare organization has made it a mandate for them to test, over 24 drugs that they deemed as high risk, and they put that through the ringer and make sure that every batch for those 24 drugs are independently tested with their certificate of analysis before they give it to a patient. And that's amazing type of thing that more healthcare systems need to lead like that. Dave, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think the main point there is that it can be done. Right? Kaiser has over 12 million patients in their health system, and they're able to do this. Means others can too.
So I'm getting a lot of questions about how do I know what I have and how can I tell the quality? And right now, again, it's just kind of staying with the manufacturer that you're feeling well on. If you start to not feel well, before you start increasing dosages or stopping medication because you don't like the side effects, please talk to your healthcare professional and identify what might be going on, look at your labels, and maybe we just try a different manufacturer, or these are the simple solutions that we have right now. I wish I could say, check this listing and it'll tell you if your batch was inspected, but we're not doing that. It doesn't exist right now. Hopefully someday we will. We've got another couple of questions about, well, is there a vote coming up or what's going on? So David, could you talk a little bit about the TRACT Act and how that is attached to the Department of Defense authorization funding?
Yeah, no, and I know we got to talk a fair amount about it at the HCMA Hill Day, and there is slow but steady progress. Nothing moves that fast in DC or in the world of government. But happy to say that there's been a lot of engagement with a specific legislation called the Transparency and Quality in Pharmaceuticals Act. And the idea there is that it's essentially attached to the Defense Department or the National Defense Authorization Act. Long story short, ensuring that the Defense Department for their essential medicines are buying green and avoiding red. The cycle for the National Defense Authorization Act is annual. Every year they pass that they pass that law. And I think it's an amazing opportunity to create not just another Kaiser-like health system, a Kaiser doing this for 12 million people. The military health system and TRICARE is about 9.5, 10 million people. The VA has 10 or so million people that use the pharmacy benefit. These are big chunks of the United States. These are large health systems. But a really exciting part is that if it's being done on the government side, it's a higher standard. I think it's you've seen this with CMS and hospitals and leapfrog ratings. You can now look at hospitals and there's different ratings that had a lot of resistance in the beginning, but now it has to do with the reimbursement levels. It has to do with how the whole business model of operating a hospital functions. And once you can really start to get this in on a government side, I think it can have a tremendous impact overall to the industry. Rosemary Gibson's point of, could HHS and some government, agencies and specific people there push the private industry to start to adopt this and to start seeing a new level of standard. I think has tremendous potential. And so that's why we're pushing really hard on it, and really appreciate Lisa, your support, and then HCMA support on that. It's making some progress, and I think even that concept, and this is kind of the summary of the Tract Farm Act as well, is that it's an optimization, it's a continuous improvement process of we want more green, we want the green to even get better. What was a 5-star rated mid-size sedan in 1980 is not the same that you would give a 5-star rating today, right? They keep getting better. And you need those ratings because if you have none, if you just have, well, we have cars that are legal to drive on the road. That's just the minimum standard. And that's something that people don't often realize. And even some of these questions are like, well, what about the USP standard, the FDA standard? Aren't these tests meeting standards? That's the minimum standard. You're allowed to have 5 micrograms of lead, 15 micrograms of arsenic in your drug. Now, if you had an option of 14 grams of arsenic or 0 grams of micrograms of arsenic, wouldn't you prefer the 0? Shouldn't we go for the 5-star rating of as much as possible, not having these contaminants, as opposed to just the minimum standard? And that's how the FDA defines this, is minimum standard. So I think that all sums up what we'll hopefully be able to do once this turns into a higher standard.
So 2 questions are related to the current political tenor and wondering if this is the time for change on this particular issue. And I actually, strangely, feel optimistic about this. we can disagree on political stances or how to get to an end result. That's fine. But if we're talking about cleaning up regulations and keeping Americans safer from threats, foreign or domestic, like this is a threat, which I think is why DOD took very much interest in this. It's a threat to not know what we're putting in our bodies. And I think that the current administration, at least the current HHS, seems very fixated on what we're putting into our bodies. And I would argue, RFK, if you're listening, you're worried about tiny levels of methylmercury in vaccinations, but Americans are taking toxins every day in the generic drugs that they're taking. We need to focus on that because a lot more patients are taking drugs every single day than once a year vaccines. So I think there's a lot to be done here, and I think this is the time. And it is going to be difficult. I'm not going to be able to get to every single question. There were some themes here that we covered. So we got the TRACK Act as a potential piece of legislation within the DoD funding, which typically happens later in the year. But there might be some other opportunities that we find within regulatory or other language that will help us provide safer drugs for Americans. I know we're just the HCMA and we're just the 1 in 250 people population here and all the other thick heart muscle disorders that we represent. But this is important to our families. If we're not getting proper drugs, we're going to have worse outcomes. If we're having worse outcomes, we've already got enough stuff to deal with our HCM. Thank you very much. We want our drugs to be good quality. So everything that we can do to make that happen, we're willing to do. You're all going to be getting a follow-up email in the next couple of days with reminders to fill out the UJoin campaign and reminders to fill out the survey, and we'll be distributing the survey in other places as well. We need everybody to get involved here. And I think we have a really good opportunity in the next 12 to 24 months to really make some significant improvement in something that has been woefully broken since before 2007. So we don't have to point fingers at anybody. It's broke. Let's just fix it and move on. So I will wrap up the questions there. Thank you for the engaging questions. They were great. If we didn't answer something completely for you, feel free to just drop us an email at support@4hcm.org, and we will get back to you as quickly as we can. Chris, Harry, David, Vic, Julie, thank you for joining us tonight and doing all the back end work to get this to happen. To all of our partners in this endeavor, including our friends over at MedShadow and Catherine Eban and Rosemary Gibson, who have done, when I say those books have the receipts, ladies and gentlemen, those books have the receipts. Go get the books. You'll understand the problem at a deeper level than we could do in an hour. But it is an important issue. It is important to the health of ourselves, our families, and our community. And failure is not an option here for me. It may take some time to get done, but we're going to get it done. David, Vic, thanks for the visionary work here and helping protect families. And Harry, thank you for your passion. It has been infectious since 2007 in all the right ways. So thank you for caring so much about your patients. Chris, thank you for sharing your story with us. Thanks for joining us on this episode of a podcast or a webinar from the HCMA. We've got some other stuff coming up later in the year. If you're in the Seattle area, don't forget we have an in-person meeting at the end of July. Please sign up soon. And tomorrow, as long as I'm not sick, I have 2 podcasts. I'll be podcasting with Steve Alman from the Mayo Clinic, and I will be podcasting with a new friend who is a pediatric cardiologist from the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. So come back tomorrow and hear us talk a little bit more about all things HCM and how we can improve lives through getting better generic drugs and getting proper treatment. Thank you all and have a good evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We will stop out here. I got a bunch of stuff to stop. Okay, guys, but I'm going to just log off. Thank you all.
Okay.
Have a good
Thanks.
night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.